So the final presentation by Professor Zach Steel, Traumatic Horror, Injustice, Embitterment and Shame, the Impact of Moral Injury in the Workplace. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you. So everybody, I'd just like you to stand up. So you've got one of two options. You can stretch or you can do 5 squats. I may do the squats. Back down. It's very hard after lunch to listen to anything. So I work in a hospital setting and a university setting. But in our hospital setting, we've been running a PTSD program for first responders and veterans and currently serving personnel for about coming up to 30 years now. And, you know, the field has been dominated, and Kim sort of suggested it, by a fairly simplistic understanding of PTSD injury. And there were some brilliant researchers about 30 years ago that really thought at the very core of PTSD is a damage to fundamental neurological systems inside of us that promote survival. I tend to, when I'm talking to first responders and military, to talk about it as an injury. In medicine, we tend to have illnesses and disorders. Illness is where we really know the pathological entity involved, and disorder is where we pick it up on its signs, symptoms and course. But injuries and the functional consequences of injuries are often a disorder. And PTSD presents very much like a disorder. My take on the evidence might even be a little bit different to some of Kim's earlier. I think there's very little evidence about risk factors for it, apart from the trauma, you know, pre-morbid personality risk factors. They don't get replicated, they're not very strong. It's like an injury, you know, it either happens to you or it doesn't. We do know that the more stress you put on these neurobiological networks, the more likely they are to get injured across time. So these brilliant researchers came up with this idea of, at the heart of it is a damage to the threat system inside the core part of the brain. And so much of the neuroimaging is where all the threat processing in the brain occurs. So humans are built with these fundamental systems that promote this, and they're extraordinarily powerful. When you look at people doing training exercises, some of you have been involved in doing training exercises, when your resting heart rate prior to a training episode jumps up from 80 to 150 just in anticipation of the threat, you know it's a powerful endocrinological system that's being engaged. So we have these very powerful systems inside of us, and these become activated. And, you know, myself and my colleagues describe this kind of a system as a threat terror response system that you can train actually to be operationally effective. And you become, you know, and a lot of the training that the services do are to train people how to not freeze, but to become effective, operationally effective in the midst of a terror threat response. And in fact, your training can go to such a level that you won't even mobilize a terror threat response when everybody else has it, because you've got such mastery over the experience. But there are some things about this the threat terror response that seem to be biologically primed. When we are entering a situation of danger, we just will scan for threat. You know, we will constantly look for threat. Threat will also pervade the everyday. It's worse if it's unpredictable. It's worse if we can't control it. So those are the situations where the threat response will become mobilised to a heightened level. Now, this is meant to be a dynamic system that's able to come on and down-regulate following an incident. But we do know that the onset of this system is rapid, the offset of it is slow, even from the half-life of many of the neurochemicals and endocrinological systems release are quite long. So these kind of dysregulations after a critical incident, they just last a long time. And this is probably why getting in early after an incident, too close to the event, does more harm than good, because there's a natural response and recovery cycle after major threatening events. Now, this early model, which is we call the Ehlers and Clark model, largely sort of suggests that this system then becomes damaged and locked on, and we have an exaggerated threat system that's engaged with us, and that's what PTSD is. And when that happens, we see all those things start to materialise in the last comma and become chronic response patterns. So the threat appraisal is just triggered all the time by reminders. In the sort of science of PTSD, we talk about this as being overgeneralized memory, where we just pick up a few things. Like a colour yellow might be a trigger for any kind of a threat response because there was a very prominent colour yellow in the context of the trauma. So we overgeneralize aspects of it, and then they become triggers. Everybody has different triggers, so you don't know what they are. And when you're working with people that are injured, this is why the trauma-informed approach that Andrea is so important. You won't know somebody's trigger until they get triggered, because it's lost in the history of their trauma. So there's often there's this high sensitivity to rule violations. In the trauma world, following rules is very important because it saves lives. But in everyday life, we can't follow rules, otherwise, it becomes impossible to live. But so when you've got PTSD, there's an immediate clash. So all of those symptoms are the classic model of PTSD. And many people who have PTSD really identify with that. But actually, what seems to undo in our hospital setting, the majority of people's primarily injury has not been a damage to this. This system's damaged, but it's not the one that seems to have triggered their ultimate, really primary trauma. We find that there's another system that sits inside of us that is also, can get damaged. And when I first talked about this to veterans and first responders in the inpatient unit, I just had people come up to me and say, well, that's the first time in 20 years that anybody's said what my injury is. So just people identifying so strongly with the moral burden that is carried with many of these jobs, and how when things go tragically and terribly wrong, even though your life may never have put into any threat, that burden is crippling and injurious. And we talk about that as a moral injury. So here, if we want to look at the mechanisms of how it develops, again, trauma in this case isn't anything about life threat. It's about either being exposed to extraordinary injustice. We have a pretty simplistic system that when we see injustice, most of us will feel a surge of rage and anger in the immediate aftermath. It's pretty much hardwired in. Colleagues of ours doing primate research will tell you as well, you give a lot of bananas to one monkey and not to the others, that will create an anger, rage reaction in the other monkeys. It's hardwired into us neurobiologically. Grotesque scenes just become overwhelming, and that's something that both military and first responders often encounter. There's also a kind of a social contract to much of the work that first responders and military personnel have, is that you've got my back, I've got your back, and that allows us to do this work. Now, if there's a breakdown in that assumptive framework to protect you, that can lead to a profound sense of betrayal. We saw that at a community level with the many of the returning veterans from Vietnam, that sense of not being honoured and acknowledged for their service. So it can happen on a broad level, but it can happen on another level. The other area is just very small decisions can have dramatic consequences. You may go outside of your rules of engagement within a particular incident, or you may see others. You may be unable to execute your responsibilities for a number of quite arbitrary reasons with catastrophic consequences. So all of this will mobilise a horror response in the person, and this is a normal response, a horror response to these kinds of trauma exposures. And this horror response, of course, is adaptive. It's designed to show us the enormity of the trauma and to formulate a response. It's designed to start off with a primal scream and work that through to a resolution and a solution. But as with other types of trauma, this can become locked on. And when this system gets locked on, these are the kinds of emotions that we begin to see as being prominent in people's lives. And this research, the research base underlying this is only half a decade old, so it's just beginning to really accumulate. But we do see that certain traumatic events lead to predictably different emotional outcomes. So some are more related to fear, some are more related to shame and guilt cycles, and some are more related to rage and embitterment cycles. So this definition of moral injury started, now we've known for a very, very long time that all of this has existed. Actually, at the end of World War II, when they summarised all of the neuropsychiatric casualties, their conclusions was there were two forms of this kind of traumatic neurosis, they called it back then. One was an overstimulation of the fear response, which is that first set of symptoms, and the other one was exposure to an unresolvable emotional conflict. And that's what we're talking about here with moral injury. So these are different definitions that have been proposed, but they all try to capture that. And I just want to show you, this is results headed by Andrea, in fact, but I'll steal her thunder, of an analysis of, I think it's about 1,500, but 2,500 treated veterans in specialised trauma programs from around the country. So this is about 10 years of experience, and who's responding and who's not. Now, what I want to show you is that the people that weren't responding most to that treatment were those who were characterised by high levels of guilt, depression, disassociation and anger. Now, they're all the kinds of things that we see emerge from exposure to these morally overwhelming incidents, which in fact are very common. And many of the first responders and military personnel are quite ready for fear-provoking incidents, but they're not always quite pre-prepared for these moral burdens that come. So if we look at the actual prevalence of these events, this is from military service, so life threat and life threat to others are the most prominent experiences, but traumatic loss and aftermath of violence, being a witness to that, are also reasonably common. About 1/4 of the military personnel endorsed that. Moral injury by self, which is where you actually do some egregious act, was only endorsed by about 7%, but witnessing it was much more common. And these actually cluster together. So this is a kind of a factor analysis, and bear me for even using that term, I apologise. But it just basically says, if a person's experienced this, what else have they experienced that's similar? And you can see that's probably a little bit hard to read, and I certainly can't read it from whatever's down there. But it's listing all of the life threat variables, all of the I'm going to have to go closer, sorry. Being exposed to horrific events and then and having that moral ambiguity, and then having that kind of exposure to grotesque events, which just sort of sit together. It shows how common all these things are. So a lot of what we think about trauma is actually witnessing things or being unable to do things yourself. And these are the emotions that come up. So you can see one whole lot of emotions are about being afraid, terrified, anxious, but then being humiliated and embarrassed, being sad and guilty, rage and angry. They sit together. Now, I really wanted to show this especially. This is one very recent research, and this is about the kinds of things where you actually do something yourself. And there's acts of commission and acts of omission. Now, the thing that's most interesting there is acts of omission are associated with extraordinarily high levels of guilt and shame. That sort of 0.74 means that basically almost anybody who reported an act of omission felt extraordinary guilt and shame attached to it, and acts of commission a bit. So, and what's the difference between acts of omission and acts of commission? Well, acts of commission are pretty straightforward and obvious, right? We did it and we know we did it. Acts of omission have a lot of interpretive confusion around them. It's, I wasn't able to do something, I didn't do something I thought I should do. And you know what? It's invisible to everybody else. It's invisible to your colleagues, it's invisible to the people around you, and yet the moral burden that comes from perceived acts of omission, of a failure to do what you thought you should have done, are resulted with very high levels of ongoing distress. So, it's still an open question whether moral injury and PTSD are the same or different, and there's a big international research agenda to look at it. I consider them all part of a collection of traumatic stress injuries. And, those things can be the bit that eventually leads to an injury developing. So if you bring it all together, these things don't work in isolation within people's lives. Almost everybody who I've spoken to who identifies that actually what ended my career was a moral injury, also talk about how they've got a lot of threat-related intrusions. One of the things that we've discovered, and Kim's been at the forefront of some of this research too, is that a traumatic, we can hold actually huge amounts of trauma. And that's what allows so many men and women to do their job and to experience so much with no injury. And so you can carry a whole career with very little leakage of that into your everyday life. But a traumatic stress injury can then undo the storage of those earlier memories, so they all start to flood you after an injury. And this is sometimes why for military and first responders, that when they get the injury is more toxic and noxious because it unconsolidates a lot of other memories that had been perfectly well stored before. So often you see, one of these three domains being the key event or the key series of events that have led to the injury, but then they unleash a whole lot of other trauma which had been able to be managed beforehand. And very often, in the hospital setting, people will share how now I'm troubled by things that never used to bother me. Now, how are we for time?
Another 10 minutes.
Okay. So,
Just a question.
Yep.
Are there certain personality traits associated with the issue of acts of omission and guilt and shame?
So I'll take that one step back, and there was some early belief that neuroticism, which is like a slightly more anxious personality type, was a risk to PTSD. It's not such a strong predictor, although there's some broad bit there. So in general, there's very little evidence that personality factors contribute to risk to PTSD. It's all really about trauma load, in my view. Now, around this, we just don't know what's protective or what's not. Most of the injuries that we see are perceived acts of omission. They're the ones which many service men and women come and feel very burdened by. And they are always usually associated with great complexity and a lot of ambiguity. And people get caught into very stereotypic remembering of it. So they'll go over the event, 10,000, 1 million times in their mind, and they can never find a different outcome. But when we treat them, we go into it in much more detail, and often new information that they haven't thought about starts to remember. I don't know about, whether, the trait that you're talking about is, if people are a little bit more psychopathic, will they engage in some of these acts? But it's very difficult, often there's very strong emotions, and sometimes it's just rage at the time because of what's preceded the event and things like that. But there's that moral compromise that can happen with erosion of the standards of practice, and that's something that needs to be addressed at a cultural level. But what we see at the clinical front end is most of it is situations of ambiguity where people hold themselves to an extraordinarily high standard, and they haven't met the standard that they believed that they should have discharged, and they're crippled by that difference. And most other people, when they look at the standard they're holding them to, would say, but that's a ridiculous standard, nobody can do that. So I've got more slides and I can sort of take you through it, but I wanted to probably spare you guys a little bit too much more and just perhaps open this up at this point.
Sorry, Zach, just a question. From what you were talking about there, that suggests that the therapies that are associated with talking through the events, the sequence of the events and all those sort of things, just reinforces the guilt, the shame, the horror, the self-doubt, and actually compounds the moral injury.
Well, certainly premature reassurance can be very counterproductive and just leave people more entrapped. Brett Litz, who's one of the key people, has developed quite an innovative approach called adaptive disclosure to try to get to this. He just tries not to do that reassurance, but sometimes new memories will come up that contextualise it. So we use many of it's very early days for treatment for this. This has always been treated broadly by prolonged exposure therapy, and it shows broad response to that. But when you talk about to individuals who have identified it, they say, well, actually, that's the bit that didn't get much better. The other stuff, the fear stuff, did get much better. And unless some people have an aha moment in the midst of it, and it just gives a different slant on it. At a very practical level, my understanding of the way in which treatment can be beneficial is many of just like with PTSD, you've been having intrusions for 20 years and they haven't helped you. So why would thinking about it help you since you've done nothing but think about it for 20 years? So how could a treatment that makes you think about it when the problem is you think about it too much help you? The difference is that the way we make you think about it is with much greater specificity. It's not a stereotypic re-experiencing, it's staying with it for such a long time that your body calms down in its presence. Now, with moral injury, you do the same. You stay with it for such a long time that new nuances emerge. and you take it from that primal scream to a deeper felt response. And the treatment strategies is often to use the notion of a wise mentor that can journey with you to just reflect on the meaning of the moral dilemma you're in. Not to give you an easy way out, because most servicemen and women don't want an easy way out. They want to, honestly face what happened. So, I think there's some really good recommendations around that. I think we're all still learning about how to get people over the line, but we know it can't be done just in the abstract. It has to be done with the memories reactivated. And when you often look at the transition and emotions, this is the most interesting bit, is that things like anger can transition from anger to grief. So you get the emotional response, which had been highly stereotypical, starting to shift to a more nuanced bit. And then somehow that often holds the moral, the moral dilemma that is so tormenting people, so people can come back to it, and rather than just get that surge of rage or shame and guilt now they get the grief and the memory of that, and it's not so overwhelmingly destructive. And this is the kind of stuff that often prevents people from getting well. One of the big things that we battle with veterans and first responders, if you feel like you've had an act of commission, you also feel like you don't deserve to be well. Very often the case. So a lot of people feel like, well, what I've done, I don't deserve to ever, I didn't manage to get into that building, I didn't manage to stop that, I didn't do that, I failed on this, I don't deserve to ever get well again. And that's an outcome of the moral injury as well. And so that can shift too. And it's just remarkable how many people come into our trauma programs and say, I can see everybody else deserves here, but I don't even think I deserve to have the PTSD symptoms, because what I've done, So, not only do you have crippling PTSD, but you don't even deserve to have crippling PTSD. That's the kind of way in which it just erodes your self-worth and self-esteem. And there's lots of, I'm a great believer in all the augmented treatments of physical activity, emotional regulation and things like that, but that stuff only shifts by spending time with the trauma and allowing it to move a bit. Any questions?